A train can't climb a steep mountain. The wheels slip. The engine stalls. The whole thing slides backward. But in the 1800s, America needed railroads over the Appalachians, the Rockies, the Sierra Nevada, mountains that rose thousands of feet in just a few miles. The solution was simple and insane. Instead of going straight up, they went sideways, then reversed, then sideways again, back and forth, zigzagging up the mountain at 2 miles per hour, sometimes with passengers hanging over sheer cliffs. They called them switchback railroads, and for decades, they were the only way a train could cross a mountain. This is the story of the men who built them, the passengers who rode them, and the forgotten engineering marvel that turned America's greatest obstacle into a tourist attraction before it disappeared forever. To understand why switchback railroads existed, you first need to understand a simple piece of physics that defined 19th century transportation. A locomotive is heavy. A typical engine in the 1830s weighed between 10 and 15 tons. Add coal cars, passenger carriages, and freight behind it, and a complete train might weigh 100 tons or more, all of it rolling on smooth iron wheels against smooth iron rails. That smoothness is what makes trains efficient. A horse pulling a rail car on iron rails could move 50 tons. The reduced friction was revolutionary. But that same reduced friction created a problem nobody appreciated until they tried to climb a hill. When a locomotive attempts to ascend a grade, its wheels must grip the rail to pull itself upward. On flat ground, this isn't an issue. But as the angle increases, the force of gravity pulling the train backward begins to exceed the friction between wheel and rail. The wheels spin. The train stalls. At about 2% grade, a locomotive starts to struggle. At 3%, it's working hard. At 4%, wheels begin to slip continuously. That horrible grinding sound as iron slides against iron. And at 5% grade, most locomotives simply cannot climb at all. Think about what that means. A 5% grade is barely noticeable if you're walking, but for a train, it's an impassable wall. Now consider the American landscape in the 1820s and 1830s. The eastern seaboard was filling up with people. Cities like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore were booming. Industry was taking root, and everyone understood that the future of American prosperity lay westward, in the vast interior of the continent. But between the coast and that interior stood the Appalachian Mountains. The Appalachians aren't tall by global standards. Their peaks rarely exceed 6,000 feet. But they're wide. The mountain chain stretches from Alabama to Maine, 1,000 miles of ridges and valleys with no easy passage through. In Pennsylvania, where the need was greatest, the mountains rose in parallel walls. The Allegheny Front climbing over 2,000 feet in just a few miles. Behind it, Laurel Hill, then Chestnut Ridge, each one requiring its own crossing. The grades on mountain roads often exceeded 10%. Teamsters had to double and triple their horse teams just to haul a single wagon up the steepest sections. Freight costs were astronomical. A ton of goods that cost $2 to ship from Philadelphia to the base of the mountains might cost $15 to haul over them. This wasn't just inconvenient, it was strangling the economy. Coal deposits sat in the mountains, some of the finest anthracite in the world, hard and clean burning and desperately needed in the cities. But the cost of transporting that coal exceeded what it could be sold for. The mines operated at a loss or not at all. Iron ore waited in the hills, the raw material for an industrial revolution. But smelters needed to be near both ore and fuel and transportation, and the mountains made that combination impossible. Pennsylvania iron stayed in Pennsylvania. Farmers in the Ohio Valley grew wheat and corn in abundance, but found it cheaper to ship grain down the Mississippi to New Orleans, where it would travel by sea around Florida and up to New York, than to haul it east over the mountains. A journey of 3,000 miles was more economical than one of 300. Canals offered some hope. The Erie Canal, completed in 1825, proved that water transport could move massive quantities of goods cheaply. Shipping costs between Buffalo and New York dropped from $100 per ton to $10. But canals required flat terrain and abundant water. The Erie worked because it followed the Mohawk Valley, a natural gap through the mountains. Pennsylvania had no such gap. Pennsylvania tried anyway. The main line of public works, authorized in 1826, was meant to connect Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. But when engineers surveyed the route, they hit the same wall everyone else had. The Allegheny Front rose over 2,000 feet in just a few miles. No canal could climb it. No railroad could climb it either, not with the locomotives of the day. And that's when someone proposed an idea that sounded completely impractical. What if, instead of trying to go straight up, you went sideways? The concept wasn't new. Mountain roads had used switchbacks for centuries. The road climbs at a manageable angle, then turns sharply back on itself and climbs again in the opposite direction. Back and forth, zigzagging up the slope. The same principle could work for a railroad. Lay track at 2 or 3% grade. When you reach the limit, build a level platform. Stop the train. Reverse it onto a second track that climbs in the opposite direction. Repeat until you've reached the summit. It would be slow, it would be awkward, it would require stopping and starting repeatedly. But it might actually work. The first switchback railroad in America wasn't built to cross the Appalachians. It was built for coal. In 1818, an outcropping of anthracite coal was discovered near the small town of Mock Chunk, Pennsylvania. The name was Lenape, meaning Bear Mountain. The coal was hard, clean-burning, and incredibly valuable, and there was a lot of it. But the coal sat 9 miles from the Lehigh River, at the top of a mountain that rose over 900 feet above the valley floor. Getting it down to the river required solving a transportation problem that had no obvious solution. At first, they used pack mules, then wagons. But the grades were too steep. The costs were prohibitive. The Lehigh Coal and Navigation Company hired an engineer named Josiah White. His solution was a gravity railroad. Empty cars would be hauled to the top by mules. There, they'd be loaded with coal and released to roll downhill, controlled by brakemen who applied friction brakes. The first section opened in May 1827. It was an immediate success. A single car could carry 3 tons of coal, 30 times what a pack mule could manage. The trip down took less than 30 minutes. If you're finding this useful, hit subscribe. I explore the forgotten infrastructure that built America. New stories every week. Subscribe, and you'll be the first to know when the next one drops. But White wasn't satisfied. The coal deposits extended deeper into the mountains. That's when he turned to switchbacks. The Summit Hill and Mock Chunk Railroad eventually included 3 switchback sections. A train of empty cars would climb as far as the grade allowed. At the end of that section, the track ended at a level platform, the switch. Here, handlers would unhitch the mules and lead them around the standing cars on a narrow path cut into the hillside. Meanwhile, brakemen would set their brakes, locking each car in place. Then, one by one, the cars would be pushed backward onto the ascending track. Once repositioned, the mules were hitched to the new front and the procession began again, climbing in the opposite direction. A train might reverse a dozen times to climb a single mountain. Each reversal took 15 minutes. The entire ascent could consume most of a morning. It was tedious. It was slow. But it worked. If you could stand at one of those switchback platforms in the 1830s, this is what you would experience. First, you'd hear it. The grinding of iron wheels on iron rail. The labored breathing of mules. The creak of wooden cars. The crack of whips and shouts of handlers. And underneath it all, the wind in the trees and distant mountain streams. Then the train would appear around a bend, crawling upward at walking pace. Mules at the front, their coats dark with sweat, foam at their mouths. Behind them, cars piled high with black anthracite, each attended by a brakeman with hands on the brake levers. The train would reach the switch and shudder to a stop. Handlers would unhitch the mules and lead them around. Brakemen would call out, confirming every brake was set. The switch operator would throw the lever, and one by one, the cars would be pushed onto the ascending track. The switch platforms themselves were small miracles of engineering. They had to be perfectly level, which meant carving a flat shelf out of a mountainside that wanted nothing to do with flat surfaces. Crews had worked for weeks with picks and shovels and black powder charges to create each one. They had to be wide enough for a train to stop, for mules to walk around, for men to work safely. In terrain where every flat foot was precious, these platforms represented an enormous investment of labor. And they had to include the track switches themselves, those movable rail sections that allowed cars to be routed from one line to another. The switches were built by blacksmiths, who bent and shaped iron by hand, creating mechanisms that had to work reliably in all weather, under tremendous stress, day after day. Get a switch wrong, and a loaded coal car might roll off into the forest, tumbling down the mountainside in a cascade of destruction. Get it very wrong, and men could die, crushed between car and platform, or swept off the cliff by a derailing train. The physical labor involved in building these switchbacks was staggering. Every piece of iron rail had to be hauled up the mountain by mule or human muscle. Rails that weighed 50 pounds per foot, carried on the shoulders of men who climbed paths that made their lungs burn and their legs tremble. Every tie had to be cut from local timber and carried to its position. Oak and chestnut, felled with axes and saws, trimmed and shaped and hauled to where they were needed. A single mile of track required over 2,000 ties. Every spike had to be driven by hand. Men with heavy hammers, swinging again and again, driving iron into wood until the rail was secured. Hundreds of spikes per rail, thousands per mile, millions before the railroad was complete. The workers were a mix of recent immigrants and local laborers. Many of the immigrants were Irish, fleeing the poverty and oppression of their homeland, taking whatever work they could find in the New World. They lived in camps along the route, sleeping in rough shanties thrown together from scrap lumber and canvas. The food was basic: salt pork and beans and bread, the same meal day after day. The pay was low, barely enough to cover their keep. The work was endless, from first light until darkness made it impossible to see. Injuries were constant. Men slipped on rain-slick slopes and tumbled down the mountain, their bodies broken on the rocks below. Heavy rails crushed fingers and toes, sometimes whole hands and feet. Tools struck flesh instead of iron, opening wounds that festered without proper medical care. And when the blasting started, using black powder to break up rock formations too hard for picks, the casualty rate climbed sharply. Premature detonations, misfires that exploded when men returned to investigate, flying rock that could decapitate a man or crush his chest. No comprehensive records exist of how many men died building the Mauch-Chunk switchbacks. The companies didn't keep such records, and the workers themselves were often nameless in official documents. They appeared as line items on expense reports: wages paid, food provided, workers lost. But every mile of mountain railroad in 19th century America was purchased with blood, and Mauch-Chunk was no exception. If you walk those trails today, you walk over the graves of men whose names we will never know. By the 1840s, the Mauch-Chunk Railroad had grown into something its builders never anticipated. The coal operations were thriving beyond anyone's expectations. Thousands of tons of anthracite rolled down the mountain every week, bound for the furnaces and stoves of East Coast cities. The company expanded the mines, built new tramways, added more cars to handle the volume. But something else was happening too. Something that would give the railroad a second life long after the coal played out. People wanted to ride the railroad just for fun. The gravity descent, which the company had designed purely for efficiency, turned out to be one of the most thrilling experiences available in mid-19th century America. Think about what entertainment options existed in the 1840s. Theater, if you lived in a city. Music, if someone nearby could play. Books, if you could read. Walking, riding horses, perhaps a boat trip on a calm river. Nothing moved fast. Nothing provided the physical sensation of speed. Nothing made your heart race and your hands grip and your breath catch in your throat. Then someone rode the Mach-Chunk gravity railroad and discovered that the descent, those 9 miles of track dropping 900 feet at speeds that sometimes exceeded 50 miles per hour, was the most exhilarating experience of their lives. Word spread. Newspaper accounts described the terror and delight of the ride. Guidebooks began including Mach-Chunk as a destination, and visitors started arriving, first in dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. The Mach-Chunk Switchback Railway, as it was renamed for tourists, became one of the most popular attractions in America. By the 1870s, over 35,000 visitors rode it every year. Special passenger cars replaced the coal hoppers on the tourist runs. Cushioned seats instead of rough planks. Safety rails along the sides. Canvas awnings to provide shade on sunny days. The cars were painted in bright colors, reds and yellows and blues, festive and inviting. Hotels sprang up in Mach-Chunk to accommodate the crowds. The American House, the Mansion House, the Broadway Hotel. Their registers filled with names from Philadelphia, New York, Boston, visitors who had traveled hundreds of miles for the chance to ride the rails. Guidebooks called it the most scenic railroad ride in the world. They weren't entirely wrong. The views from the upper sections were genuinely spectacular. The Lehigh Valley spread out below like a painting, the river glinting silver in the sunlight, the forests covering the mountainsides in endless green. But the views weren't why people came. They came for the descent. The ride took 90 minutes in total. Mules hauled the passenger cars to the summit, using the switchbacks, a slow and scenic climb that gave riders time to admire the panorama and to contemplate what was coming. At the top, they could stretch their legs at a small pavilion. Vendors sold refreshments. Ladies adjusted their bonnets. Gentlemen checked their pocket watches. Everyone tried to appear calm while their hearts beat faster in anticipation. Then the cars were positioned on the descent track. Passengers took their seats, gripping the safety rails, exchanging nervous glances with their companions. The brakeman took his position at the rear, his foot on the lever, his eyes on the track ahead. And then the car was released. Gravity took over. The car began to roll, slowly at first, then faster still. The wheels hummed against the rails, a rising pitch as speed increased. Wind began to tug at clothing, at hats, at hair. The forest blurred past on either side. Trees that had been distinct individuals became a green wall of motion. The track curved ahead, and passengers leaned into the turn, feeling the car tilt beneath them, feeling forces they had never felt before. The brakeman worked the lever constantly, applying pressure to slow the car on curves, releasing it on straightaways, maintaining a speed that was terrifying but not quite fatal. Too much pressure, and the wooden brake shoes would smoke and char. Too little, and the car would accelerate beyond control. Passengers screamed. They couldn't help it. The sensation of speed, the sight of the track rushing toward them, the feeling of weightlessness as the car crested small hills, it overwhelmed the 19th century nervous system. One visitor wrote that he gripped the seat so hard his knuckles turned white while the car screamed down the mountain, the trees a green blur, the wind tearing at his hat. He said he had never felt so alive, and also never felt so certain he was about to die. The descent covered 9 miles and dropped over 900 vertical feet. Curves sent passengers leaning hard, their bodies pressed against the car's side rail. Straight sections allowed speeds that seemed impossible, the car hurtling through the forest faster than any horse could run. And through it all, the only thing between safety and disaster was the skill of the brakeman and the strength of the brakes. It was, by any reasonable definition, the first roller coaster. The engineers who designed modern roller coasters openly acknowledged their debt to Mauch Chunk. LaMarcus Thompson, who built America's first purpose-built roller coaster at Coney Island in 1884, said he was directly inspired by the Switchback Railway. He even called his ride the Gravity Switchback Railway in tribute. Thompson had ridden the Mauch Chunk descent and had recognized something the railroad operators themselves hadn't fully grasped. The terror was the product. The speed, the danger, the loss of control. These weren't problems to be minimized. They were experiences to be sold. But while tourists were enjoying the thrill of their lives in Pennsylvania, other switchback railroads were being built for very different purposes in very different places. Railroads that made Mauch Chunk look like a gentle Sunday excursion. In Colorado, the mining boom of the 1860s and 1870s created a desperate need for rail transport. Silver and gold deposits sat high in the Rocky Mountains, at elevations exceeding 10,000 feet, in terrain that would have made Pennsylvania engineers weep. Getting ore down to smelters and supplies up to miners required railroads that could climb grades the engineers back east would have considered impossible. The Denver and Rio Grande Railway, founded in 1870, specialized in narrow-gauge mountain railroads. Their tracks were just 3 feet wide instead of the standard 4 feet 8 inches, allowing them to build tighter curves and navigate narrower ledges. The narrow gauge was a necessity, not a choice. Standard gauge required wider roadbeds, gentler curves, more excavation. In the Rockies, where every cubic yard of earth had to be blasted from solid granite, narrower was the only way to build affordable. Even so, the grades in the Rockies often exceeded what any locomotive could handle. The Continental Divide didn't rise gradually like the Appalachians. It rose in walls of rock, cliffs that shot up thousands of feet, passes that required climbing from 7,000 feet to 12,000 in just a few miles. Switchbacks became essential, not a novelty or a temporary expedient, but a fundamental part of the railroad's design. The route from Denver to Leadville, one of the richest silver mining towns in America, required multiple switchback sections. Trains climbing toward the Continental Divide would reach a limit, the wheels beginning to slip, the engine unable to climb further. They would stop, reverse onto a siding, and then continue climbing in the opposite direction. The operation was similar to Mauch Chunk, but magnified in every dimension. Higher altitudes, steeper grades, worse weather, more dangerous terrain. Winter brought snow that could bury a train in hours. Storms swept down from the peaks without warning, reducing visibility to zero, coating the rails with ice, filling the cuts with drifts that no plow could clear. Trains sometimes sat stuck for days, waiting for the weather to break. Passengers huddled in unheated cars while crews dug them out. Avalanches were a constant threat. Snowpack accumulated on the steep slopes above the tracks, held in place by friction and luck until the day it decided to move. A slide could sweep an entire locomotive off the tracks, tumbling it down the mountainside, burying it under tons of white death. Summer brought its own dangers. Thunderstorms that formed over the peaks in minutes, unleashing lightning that could kill a man standing on a metal car. Flash floods that turned dry gulches into raging torrents, washing out bridges and undermining roadbeds. Rock slides triggered by the same water, sending boulders the size of houses bouncing down toward the rails. And always, there was the altitude. At 10,000 feet, the air contains roughly 30% less oxygen than at sea level. Men labored for breath, their lungs working harder to extract what they needed from the thin atmosphere. The firemen shoveling coal into locomotive boilers had the hardest job, their muscles demanding oxygen that the mountain air couldn't provide. Boilers struggled too. Water boils at a lower temperature at high altitude, which reduces the efficiency of steam engines. Locomotives designed for sea-level operation couldn't generate the same power at elevation. Engineers had to compensate with modified equipment and careful operation. A single mistake at altitude could cascade into catastrophe. A train that stalled on a switchback, its wheels spinning on icy rails, might have no way to recover. Gravity would begin pulling it backward. The brakeman would fight to hold it, but brakes designed for forward motion sometimes failed when the train reversed unexpectedly. And then you had a runaway train heading downhill backward, the engineer helpless, the brakeman fighting losing battles, the passengers screaming as the car accelerated toward a curve it would never make. If you've stayed with this story this far, you're the kind of viewer this channel is built for. Someone who cares about the people behind the machines. The workers who died so progress could continue. Hit subscribe and I'll keep bringing you these forgotten histories. The tunnels, the bridges, the railroads. The human cost of everything we built. The brakemen on these Colorado mountain routes were a special breed of worker. They rode outside the cars in all weather, hands on the brake levers, eyes fixed on the track ahead. The passenger cars and freight cars had no enclosed brake positions. You stood or sat on a small platform at the end of the car, exposed to whatever the mountain chose to throw at you. In winter, they wrapped themselves in blankets and wool coats and still suffered frostbite. Fingers that had to grip the brake lever would go numb, then white, then black at the tips. Toes inside boots that weren't warm enough, losing feeling and then losing tissue. Faces exposed to wind that cut like knives. In summer, the sun reflecting off the rock could blind a man. Headaches from the altitude. Lips cracked and bleeding from the dry air. Thirst that was never quite satisfied because water was heavy and scarce at these heights. Their job was to control the speed of the train on descent. This sounds simple until you understand the mechanics involved. A loaded ore train might weigh 100 tons. Gravity wanted to pull that weight down the mountain at ever-increasing speed, potentially reaching velocities that would destroy the train on the first serious curve. The only thing preventing a runaway was the brakeman applying pressure to the wheels. But apply too much pressure and the brake shoes would overheat. Wooden brakes could catch fire, flames licking at the car undercarriage. Metal brakes could warp and lose their shape, becoming useless precisely when they were most needed. The trick was to apply just enough pressure to maintain a safe speed without destroying the brakes before you reached the bottom. Brakemen judged this by feel and by smell. If they detected the acrid odor of burning wood or the sharper smell of overheated metal, they knew they were pushing too hard. They would ease off slightly, let the brakes cool, and then apply pressure again. All of this while the train was moving, while the wind was howling, while the track curved and twisted around the mountainside, and often while they couldn't see more than a few car lengths ahead because of fog or snow or darkness. The casualty rate among Colorado Railroad brakemen was atrocious. Falls were common. A man could lose his footing on an icy platform and tumble off the car, landing on the track or the mountainside, or simply disappearing into the void below. Crushed limbs were routine. The coupling mechanisms between cars were crude and dangerous. A brakeman might need to jump between moving cars to set a brake, landing on a narrow platform with precision timing. And sometimes that timing failed. Hands and arms caught between buffers, legs crushed when cars jolted unexpectedly. Complete disasters happened often enough that they barely made the newspapers unless the death toll was extraordinary. A runaway train, a failed brake, a curve taken too fast, cars tumbling off the rails, rolling and bouncing down the mountainside, shattering on the rocks below. One brakeman who worked the Leadville route in the 1880s later recalled that he knew at least 20 men who died on the job during his 5 years of service. Some fell from the cars. Some were crushed between carriages during coupling. Some simply disappeared during winter storms and were found in the spring when the snow melted, preserved by the cold, their bodies revealing nothing about what had gone wrong. Their names are mostly lost to history. The companies recorded their deaths as business expenses and moved on. The families received whatever wages were owed and nothing more. no pensions, no compensation. No acknowledgement that their husbands and fathers and sons had died making possible the wealth that flowed down the mountain. But every ton of silver that came out of Leadville, every gold bar that reached the Denver Mint, was purchased with their labor and often with their lives. The switchback railroads served their purpose for decades. They allowed trains to cross mountains that would otherwise have been impassable. They moved millions of tons of coal and ore. They carried hundreds of thousands of passengers. They made possible an industrial expansion that transformed America from an agricultural nation into an economic power. But they were always a compromise. They were slow. They were dangerous. And they required constant attention and maintenance that ate into profits with every passing year. As technology improved, engineers began looking for alternatives, ways to cross mountains that didn't require zigzagging up their faces, ways that were faster, safer, more efficient. The most obvious solution was tunnels. Instead of going over a mountain, you could go through it. A tunnel running level through the base of a ridge would eliminate the need for grades entirely. Trains could move faster, carry heavier loads, and operate more safely. The problem was that tunnel construction in the 19th century was brutally difficult and enormously expensive. The rock of the Appalachians and Rockies was ancient and hard. Granite that had been cooling and compressing for millions of years. Quartzite formed from sandstone under enormous pressure. Gneiss striped with bands of different minerals. Breaking through it required either black powder blasting or manual labor with picks and drills. Progress was measured in feet per day, sometimes inches. A crew of skilled miners might advance a tunnel face by 3 feet in a 24-hour period if the rock was favorable. If the rock was particularly hard, they might manage 1 foot. If they hit water, requiring constant pumping, they might gain nothing at all. The Hoosac Tunnel in Massachusetts became the most famous example of both the promise and the cost of mountain tunneling. Begun in 1851, it was designed to carry the Troy and Greenfield Railroad through the Hoosac Mountain, eliminating a difficult climb over the summit. The tunnel was less than 5 miles long. The engineers estimated it would take 3 years to complete. It took nearly 25 years. The rock was harder than expected. The funding kept running out. Contractors went bankrupt and were replaced by other contractors who also went bankrupt. The state of Massachusetts took over the project, then private investors, then the state again. New technologies had to be invented to make progress possible. Compressed air drills replaced hand drilling, tripling the rate of advance. Nitroglycerin replaced black powder for blasting, but also increased the danger exponentially. Nearly 200 workers died during the Hoosac Tunnel construction. Blasting accidents that tore men apart. Cave-ins that buried them alive. A fire in the central shaft that trapped 13 workers deep underground, their bodies not recovered for a year. The project bankrupted multiple contractors. It nearly bankrupted the state. It became a national symbol of both human ambition and human folly. But when it finally opened in 1875, the Hoosac Tunnel proved the value of the approach. Trains that had previously spent hours on switchbacks and inclined planes now crossed the mountain in minutes. Operating costs plummeted. Capacity increased dramatically. The tunnel paid for itself within a decade of opening. Other tunnels followed, each one learning from the mistakes and successes of its predecessors. The Cascade Tunnel in Washington bored through the Cascade Range. The Moffett Tunnel in Colorado finally providing a direct route through the Continental Divide. The Allegheny Tunnel in Pennsylvania, part of the Pennsylvania Railroad's main line west. Each one replaced switchbacks that had served for years or decades. Each one represented the triumph of boring through over zigzagging over. The Mauch-Chunk Switchback Railway held on longer than most. Its tourist traffic remained strong even as the coal operations shifted to more efficient routes. The thrill of the gravity descent couldn't be replicated by a dark passage through a mountain. But by the early 20th century, the competition had grown too intense. Automobiles offered new forms of recreation. Purpose-built amusement parks provided more consistent thrills. Coney Island and its imitators could offer the roller coaster experience without requiring a trip to the Pennsylvania mountains. The railroad equipment was aging. The original cars had been replaced and replaced again, but the fundamental infrastructure was wearing out. The track needed constant maintenance. The switch mechanisms required attention. The cost of keeping it all running was rising every year. In 1933, the Mauch Chunk Switchback Railway carried its last passengers. The cars were retired, some preserved by museums, most simply left to rot. The track was torn up, the iron sold for scrap during the Depression when every penny mattered. The right-of-way was sold to the state. Today, that route is a hiking and biking trail. It's called the Switchback Railroad Trail, and it stretches 18 miles through the forests above what is now called Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania. The town changed its name in 1954. Mauch Chunk, struggling economically after the railroad's closure and the decline of the coal industry, made a peculiar deal. Jim Thorpe, the famous Olympic athlete, had died the year before, and his widow was looking for a community willing to build a memorial. Mauch Chunk offered to rename itself in exchange for becoming his final resting place. So Bear Mountain became Jim Thorpe. The Lenape name erased, replaced by the name of a man who never lived there and visited only in death. The town's identity subsumed into a marketing strategy. If you walk the trail today, you can still see evidence of what came before. Stone culverts that carried mountain streams beneath the track, their masonry still solid after nearly 2 centuries. Cuts in the hillside where the grade was leveled, the rock still showing the marks of picks and drills. The flat platforms where the switches once stood, now overgrown with trees, but still recognizably artificial, still flat in a landscape that resists flatness. The views are still spectacular. The Lehigh Valley spreads out below, greener now than it was when the coal smoke filled the air. The river runs cleaner, no longer choked with mining runoff and industrial waste. Hawks circle over the ridges, riding the thermals that rise from the sun-warmed rock. Deer watch from the forest edge, unafraid of the quiet hikers who have replaced the screaming tourists. It's peaceful, in a way it never was when the railroad operated. When the cars rumbled past every few minutes, when the mules strained and the handlers shouted, when the brakemen called out to each other, and the tourists screamed with terror and delight. But that peace was purchased by the labor of men whose names we've forgotten. Men who carved these shelves out of living rock with picks and shovels and black powder. Men who drove the spikes that held the rails, swing after swing after swing. Men who hauled the coal that heated a nation's homes and powered its factories. Men who died in falls from slippery mountainsides. Men who died in blasting accidents when the powder fired too soon. Men who died in runaway cars when the brakes failed. Men who died and were buried in unmarked graves, and whose families received nothing but what wages were owed. If you want to understand what those switchback railroads meant, consider this. They weren't supposed to work. Everything about them violated the basic engineering principles of railroad construction. Trains were supposed to run continuously on gentle grades. They were supposed to maintain momentum. They were supposed to be efficient machines that minimized human labor and maximized throughput. Switchbacks were none of these things. They were slow. They were dangerous. They required stopping and starting repeatedly, throwing away the momentum that was a locomotive's greatest asset. They demanded constant human attention at every step, from the handlers managing the mules, to the brakemen controlling the cars, to the switch operators throwing the rails. But they worked anyway. They worked because the men who built and operated them refused to accept that the mountains were impassable. They looked at a problem that seemed unsolvable and found a solution that was ugly and impractical and barely functional. And then they made it work through sheer stubbornness and effort. The tunnels that eventually replaced them were superior in every technical way: faster, safer, more efficient, more profitable over the long term. But the tunnels weren't possible in 1827 or 1850 or even 1870 in most places. The technology wasn't there. The blasting techniques were too primitive. The ventilation systems didn't exist. The capital needed for such massive projects hadn't been accumulated. The switchbacks bought time. They kept the coal flowing while engineers figured out how to bore through mountains without killing everyone involved. They kept the ore moving while the mining companies accumulated the capital needed for tunnel construction. They kept America's industrial expansion on schedule during the decades when the alternative would have been to simply stop at the mountains and wait. That's what the switchback railroads were, ultimately. A refusal to wait. A refusal to accept limits. A willingness to solve impossible problems with imperfect solutions and pay the cost in human labor and human lives. We don't build like that anymore. Modern engineering emphasizes optimization and efficiency. We model our solutions in computers before we ever break ground. We calculate risk factors and cost-benefit ratios. We conduct environmental impact studies. We would never build a switchback railroad today. And perhaps that's progress. Perhaps it's better that we no longer ask men to risk their lives controlling runaway coal cars or climbing ice-covered mountainsides to throw hand-operated switches. Perhaps it's better that we find the optimal solution before we begin, rather than improvising our way through impossible problems. But something was lost when the switchbacks closed. Not just a form of transportation, but a way of thinking about problems, a willingness to attempt the impractical, a stubbornness in the face of obstacles that said, "We will not go around. We will not give up. We will go through this difficulty inch by inch and reversal by reversal until we reach the other side." The next time you drive through a mountain tunnel, think about what it replaced. Think about the zigzag paths carved into the slopes above. Think about the platforms where trains stopped and reversed and stopped again. Think about the brakemen with their hands on the levers and their eyes on the track. They didn't go around the mountains. They didn't wait for tunnels that might never come. They went up, the hard way, reversal by reversal, mile by mile, man by man. That's how America crossed its mountains before the tunnels came. Not with elegance or efficiency, but with stubbornness and sweat and blood. The switchback railroads are gone now. The tracks are pulled up. The cars are rotted away or preserved in museums where visitors peer at them through glass and try to imagine what it must have been like. The men who built them and operated them have been dead for a century or more. But the mountains remain, unchanged by human ambition or human tragedy. And if you know where to look, you can still trace the zigzag paths they cut through the forests. You can still stand on the platforms where the trains reversed. You can still feel the grade beneath your feet and imagine what it must have been like to ride those rails, climbing toward the summit one reversal at a time. They called it impossible, and then they did it anyway. That's the story of the switchback railroads. That's the story of how America crossed its mountains before it learned to tunnel through them. If this story meant something to you, hit subscribe. New videos every week on the forgotten infrastructure that built America. The tunnels, the bridges, the railroads, the men. I'll see you in the next one.